Rebecca adjusted the hem of her navy blue dress, taking a deep breath as she looked at herself in the mirror. The silk fabric hugged her figure with elegance, emphasizing her poised stance. She had always carried herself with confidence, a trait that came naturally after years of building not only a successful business, but also a life she believed was stable. Tonight was supposed to be another one of those routine family dinners at her in-laws' house, an event she never particularly enjoyed, but attended out of obligation. 15 years of marriage came with certain responsibilities after all. From the moment she and James arrived, though, Rebecca sensed something was off. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. Whispers halted the second she entered the grand dining room, eyes darting toward her with something she could only describe as pity. Margaret, her best friend, and the only reason she tolerated these events, was missing from the usual crowd. Rebecca made a mental note to call her later, but for now she plastered on her usual composed smile. The evening unfolded like any other. Polite small talk, extravagant food, and her father-in-law droning on about business as if he were the only one in the family capable of running a company, as if Rebecca hadn't built the empire alongside James from the ground up. Then the moment came. James stood raising his glass in a gesture that signaled a toast. Rebecca turned to him, expecting the usual speech about success, hard work, or even a generic appreciation for family. Instead, he smiled, a smug, satisfied smirk that sent an uneasy chill down her spine. "To new beginnings," he announced, his voice dripping with false charm. "To freedom, and to finally letting go of the dead weight we've all been carrying." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Rebecca blinked, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. What the hell was he talking about? Then, as if on cue, the doors swung open. A woman walked in, tall, young, and confident. Her fiery red dress clung to her body in a way that demanded attention. Rebecca didn't recognize her at first, but then the woman's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smirk, and Rebecca knew. She knew before anyone had to say a word. Ava, the company's new executive assistant. The whispers around the room turned to a deafening silence. Some looked away awkwardly, while others watched with barely concealed interest, waiting for the inevitable explosion. James didn't even have the decency to look guilty. Instead, he beamed, lifting his glass higher. "My new chapter," he said, almost gleeful, "without the excess baggage." The words hit Rebecca like a slap. Dead weight, excess baggage. He meant her. A slow burn of fury spread through her chest, but she refused to react. Not here, not in front of them. Instead, she tilted her chin up, forcing an unreadable expression onto her face. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Ava, emboldened by the silence, stepped forward, her voice laced with amusement. "I suppose I should formally introduce myself," she said, her eyes locked on Rebecca. "Though I imagine you've already figured it out." Rebecca didn't flinch. Ava smiled wider. "He wanted to tell you, you know, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it." She let out a mock sigh. "Men, right?" Always avoiding the hard conversations. A few awkward chuckles broke the silence, but most people remained frozen, watching the unfolding scene like a slow-motion car crash. Rebecca had heard enough. Calmly, she set her glass down on the table. "Is that so?" she said, her voice deceptively smooth. "And how long has my husband been struggling with this particular hard conversation?" Ava's smile sharpened. "Oh, months." There it was, the confirmation. Months of lies, months of stolen moments. And now this, a public execution of their marriage orchestrated by the man she had built her life with. Rebecca glanced around the room. They all knew. The pitying looks, the discomfort, the silence they had known before she did. And that, more than anything, fueled her rage. Still, she didn't let it show. Not yet. She simply smoothed a hand over the fabric of her dress and smiled, the kind of smile that preceded a storm. "Well," she said, her voice light but deadly. "That must have been expensive." James frowned, caught off guard. "What?" Rebecca's smile didn't waver. "The gifts, the trips, the hotel stays, the shopping sprees." She turned to Ava with a polite nod. I assume he was generous. Ava faltered, casting a wary glance at James. Rebecca let the moment stretch before delivering the final blow. I just hope you enjoyed it while it lasted, she said, her tone casual. After all, it was my money. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few stifled laughs. Even James's parents looked stunned. James paled, his bravado cracking. Rebecca, let's not... She held up a hand. Oh no, please. Finish your toast, she said sweetly. We wouldn't want to interrupt your big moment. Silence. For the first time that night, James looked unsure, like a man who had just realized he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. Rebecca, however, had never been more certain. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to plead. She was going to win. And by the time she was done, James would wish he had never underestimated her. Rebecca hadn't slept. She had spent the night sitting on the edge of her bed, still wearing the navy blue dress from the disastrous dinner, staring at the city lights outside her window. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's smug face, heard the gasps, the whispers, the mocking lilt in Ava's voice. She had walked out of that room without shedding a tear, her back straight, her expression unreadable. But inside she had been burning alive. Now, with the first light of dawn creeping through the curtains, she finally stood. Her limbs were stiff, her body exhausted, but her mind sharper than ever. She reached for her phone and dialed the one person she knew would answer. Margaret picked up immediately. I swear to God, Rebecca, if you don't let me break something today, I'm going to explode. A bitter smile touched Rebecca's lips. You'll have your chance. Good. There was a sharp exhale on the other end. I've been up all night picturing ways to ruin that bastard. What's the plan? Rebecca walked to her closet, pulling out a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks. She unzipped the dress she had worn to dinner, letting it slip from her shoulders and pool onto the floor. It smelled like wine and betrayal. She would never wear it again. I'm going to make sure he regrets everything, she said, buttoning up her blouse with steady fingers. And it starts today. When Rebecca stepped into Gustavo Nogueira's office later that morning, he was already waiting for her, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand and a knowing smirk on his face. I was expecting your call, he said, gesturing for her to sit. I assume this is about James. Rebecca lowered herself into the chair across from him, crossing her legs. I want him cut off completely. Gustavo set his coffee down and leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Tell me exactly how ruthless you want to be. A dark, satisfied feeling curled inside her, as ruthless as possible. The next 30 minutes were a whirlwind of signatures and legal paperwork. Gustavo moved quickly, making calls and sending urgent instructions to the banks. By the time Rebecca walked out of his office, James's credit cards were frozen. His access to joint accounts was revoked, and every personal fund tied to Rebecca's name had been transferred to an account only she controlled. The man who had publicly humiliated her now had nothing, and he didn't even know it yet. She arrived at the company headquarters just before noon, stepping into the elevator with her head held high. Employees glanced at her, some offering hesitant smiles, others quickly looking away. Rebecca knew what that meant. They had heard. Let them talk. By the time she reached the boardroom, most of the senior executives were already seated. Conversations halted when she walked in. Alvaro, one of the company's longest-serving directors, straightened in his chair. Rebecca, he greeted, his voice carefully neutral. To what do we owe the pleasure? She closed the door behind her, surveying the room. This won't take long. She took a seat at the head of the table, the place James usually claimed during meetings, and let a few beats of silence stretch before she spoke. As of this morning, she said, her tone cool and businesslike, James Lima no longer has access to the company's financials. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few exchanged glances, some in shock, others in what looked like quiet approval. Alvaro frowned. I'm sorry, what? Rebecca folded her hands on the table. He has been using company funds for personal expenses, she continued, her voice even. Extravagant trips, unapproved purchases, a second apartment. She saw the understanding dawn in their eyes. They knew exactly what apartment she was referring to. Gasps followed. Someone cursed under their breath. "I've taken measures to ensure the company is no longer at risk," she finished. Silence stretched across the boardroom. Then Alvaro cleared his throat. "Are you telling us James has been stealing from the company?" "Yes," she said simply. There was no arguing after that. The room quickly fell into discussion, some outraged, others concerned about the company's image. But the most important thing was clear. James had just lost his grip on the empire he thought he controlled, and he hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. Rebecca returned home that evening feeling something she hadn't felt in months: control. But the moment she stepped inside, she found James standing in the middle of the living room, his phone in his hand, his face twisted in fury. Her heartbeat didn't even spike. She had been expecting this. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. She set her bag down with deliberate calm. "I assume you're referring to your frozen accounts." He took a step toward her. "You can't do this, Rebecca." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I just did." His jaw clenched, his breathing sharp. He looked like a man on the verge of an explosion. "This is my house too, you can't just—" Rebecca let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Oh, James, you should have paid more attention when we signed the paperwork." His frown deepened. She reached for a folder sitting on the coffee table and slid it toward him. He hesitated before picking it up, his eyes scanning the pages. And then he paled. Because there, in official black ink, was proof that Rebecca was the sole owner of the apartment, which meant he had no claim to it. His fingers curled around the edges of the paper. "You've got to be kidding me." Rebecca tilted her head. "You have 5 minutes to pack whatever you can carry," she said smoothly. "Then you leave." He stared at her, eyes burning with disbelief. "And where the hell am I supposed to go?" She pretended to think for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe Ava's place." The words hit like a bullet. For the first time, James looked genuinely speechless. His face flickered with something almost vulnerable: panic. Rebecca walked past him, retrieving a suitcase she had already packed and shoving it against his chest. 5 minutes, she repeated, "or I call security." His lips parted like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to throw out another cruel insult. But he had nothing left. No money, no power, no home. Rebecca watched as realization settled over him like a heavy weight. And then, with a final glare, he grabbed his suitcase and walked out the door. The moment it closed behind him, Rebecca exhaled slowly. The first battle was won. But the war had only just begun. For the first time in 15 years, Rebecca woke up alone in her apartment. No presence on the other side of the bed, no lingering scent of James's cologne in the bathroom, no distant sounds of him moving around in the morning. Just silence. She stretched, feeling the unfamiliar weight of freedom settling over her. It felt good. After a long shower, she dressed in a sleek black dress and heels, her mind already on the day ahead. There was still work to be done, but the moment she stepped into the kitchen, her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, expecting a message from Margaret or Gustavo. Instead, the screen displayed a name that sent a chill down her spine. James. She let it ring. Let him suffer in silence. But when her phone buzzed again, this time with a message, curiosity got the better of her. She tapped the screen. "James, you think you won?" "This isn't over, Rebecca." Her lips curled into a smirk. Oh, it was far from over. But he was the one who was about to regret it. The office was already buzzing with whispers when Rebecca arrived. Employees stole glances at her as she walked through the halls, their eyes filled with curiosity and maybe a little admiration. She ignored them and made her way to her private office, where Margaret was already waiting, leaning against the desk with her arms crossed. "You saw the news?" Margaret asked, her eyes sharp. Rebecca frowned. "What news?" Margaret picked up the remote and turned on the TV mounted on the wall. The moment the screen flickered to life, Rebecca's stomach twisted. A news anchor was speaking in a serious tone, and behind her a large headline read, "Business tycoon James Lima accuses ex-wife of financial fraud." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The footage cut to James, standing outside a lawyer's office, a well-rehearsed look of concern on his face. "My wife and I built our company together," he said, his voice oozing with false sincerity. "But recently I discovered financial irregularities. I have no choice but to take legal action to ensure the integrity of our business." Rebecca tightened her grip on the armrest of her chair. "The bastard." Margaret turned off the TV. "He's going for the sympathy vote, pretending to be the betrayed husband while making you look like the villain." Rebecca exhaled slowly. She should have seen this coming. She had destroyed James financially, humiliated him, kicked him out of his own home. Of course, he wouldn't take it lying down. But this was dirty. And it was only the beginning. By noon, things escalated. Rebecca was in the middle of reviewing financial statements when Gustavo stormed into her office, his expression tight with frustration. "We have a problem," he announced, dropping a stack of papers on her desk. She flipped through them, scanning the highlighted sections. Her stomach twisted. Large sums of money had been transferred out of the company's accounts over the past 6 months, transactions that had been signed under her credentials. She looked up sharply. "This is fabricated." Gustavo nodded grimly. "Yes, but it looks real." Rebecca set the papers down, her mind racing. James had been planning this for months. Even before the affair was exposed, he had been setting her up, making it look like she was the one stealing from the company. And now, he was using it as leverage. Her phone rang. James again. This time she answered. "Enjoying the headlines?" he asked, his voice smug. She kept her tone cold. "How long have you been planning this?" James chuckled. "Does it matter? What matters is that I have enough to take you down." Rebecca clenched her jaw. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" he mused. "Let's see. The board is already nervous. Investors are starting to ask questions. You think they'll stick by you when the police come knocking?" Rebecca's fingers tightened around the phone. "You're pathetic." James's voice dropped lower, amusement laced in every word. "Admit it, Rebecca. You should have just let me walk away with a fair deal, but now," a pause, "now I'll make sure you lose everything." The line went dead. Rebecca exhaled slowly, the storm inside her rising. James wanted a war. Then she'd give him one. Rebecca sat motionless in her office, James's words still ringing in her ears. "Now I'll make sure you lose everything." The bastard had spent months setting this up. The fake transactions, the media attack, the sudden shift from cheating husband to wronged business partner. It was all a trap. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. Panic was useless. Fear was useless. But strategy would save her. She picked up her phone and dialed Margaret. "We need to move fast," she said as soon as her friend answered. "Meet me in Gustavo's office in 20 minutes. Gustavo's office was already tense when Rebecca arrived. Margaret was there, pacing, and Gustavo stood behind his desk, flipping through documents with a grim expression. "I had my team dig deeper," he said the moment Rebecca closed the door behind her. "And what we found is bad." He turned the papers toward her. Rebecca leaned in, scanning the details. There it was, the offshore account, the millions funneled away, the transactions approved using her credentials. Her stomach turned. "This isn't just a public relations problem anymore," Gustavo said. "If the authorities believe you were behind this, you could be facing criminal charges." Rebecca's fingers clenched around the edges of the desk. "There has to be proof that I didn't authorize these transfers." Margaret stepped forward. "Could James have used your accounts without you noticing?" Rebecca frowned, thinking back. Then a memory hit her like a punch to the gut. A few months ago, James had insisted on fixing her personal laptop. Something about updating security software. At the time, she hadn't questioned it, hadn't thought twice. Now she knew exactly what he had been doing. "He installed something," she whispered, realization crashing over her. "He must have used spyware to track my logins, steal my credentials, and approve the transfers under my name." Gustavo's expression darkened. "If that's true, we need to prove it." Rebecca nodded, her mind already racing. "Then let's find someone who can." By nightfall, Rebecca and Margaret were sitting in a dimly lit apartment in front of a man named Lucas, a cybersecurity expert Margaret had contacted through her own network. He was in his early 30s, with messy dark hair and the sharp calculating look of someone who lived in a world of codes and data breaches. Lucas leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. "You want me to find proof that your husband hacked you?" Rebecca met his gaze. "Yes, and I need it fast." He smirked. "I like a challenge." With that, he pulled out a laptop and got to work. Minutes passed in tense silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of keys as Lucas navigated through her old laptop, running deep scans and checking for hidden malware. Then suddenly, he let out a low whistle. "Well, well," he murmured. "Someone definitely screwed with your system." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "You found something?" Lucas turned the laptop around. On the screen was a line of malicious code, a keystroke logger. "This little guy," Lucas explained, tapping the screen, "was recording everything you typed. Every password, every login, every financial authorization. And guess where it was sending that information?" He hit another key and an IP address popped up. Rebecca's breath caught. It led straight to James. Margaret let out a sharp laugh. "That son of a bitch." Lucas sat back, folding his arms. "With this evidence, you can prove James was behind the fraudulent transfers." Rebecca exhaled, relief and fury battling inside her. "Can you retrieve deleted messages or emails? Anything that connects him directly to the offshore account?" Lucas grinned. "Give me an hour." Rebecca leaned back, a slow, dangerous smile curling on her lips. James thought he was untouchable. He had no idea what was coming. Rebecca had always believed in strategy over impulse, but this time she was ready to play dirty. With Lucas's evidence in hand, she had everything she needed to prove James had orchestrated the fraud. But simply proving him guilty wasn't enough. She wanted him to drown in his own trap. Sitting in her office the next morning, she swirled a cup of coffee in her hand, staring at her phone screen. She had drafted the message 10 minutes ago, but she let it sit there unread. Then, with a slow inhale, she pressed send. "Rebecca, let's talk. I have a proposal for you." She didn't have to wait long. A minute later, her phone buzzed. "James, I knew you'd come to your senses. Meet me at my lawyer's office this afternoon." Rebecca smirked. Perfect. The lawyer's office was a sleek, soulless place, cold marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that screamed overpriced minimalism. James was already there when she arrived, sitting across from his lawyer. His suit was immaculate, his posture relaxed. He looked smug. Rebecca hated that expression. She slid into the seat across from him, placing her hands neatly on the table. "I assume you're here to negotiate," James said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. She tilted her head. "Something like that." His lawyer cleared his throat. "My client is willing to settle if you agree to a 50-50 division of all shared assets." Rebecca let out a soft laugh. "You mean the assets that I built? That I funded?" She shook her head. "Not happening." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Be reasonable, Rebecca. If this drags on, the scandal will ruin you." She met his gaze, her voice calm. "Oh, I don't think so." Then she pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. James hesitated before flipping it open. His smug expression didn't falter, at first. Then he saw the IP logs, the keystroke tracker records, the digital trail leading straight back to him. His lawyer stiffened beside him. "James, what is this?" Rebecca crossed her legs, watching the slow, dawning horror in his eyes. "That," she said smoothly, "is proof that you fabricated financial fraud under my name." James swallowed, his fingers tightening on the edges of the paper. She leaned forward. "I could take this to the authorities right now. Within hours, you'd be facing charges for financial fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement." She let that sink in. "But I'm feeling generous, so I'm giving you a choice." His jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Rebecca sat back, savoring the moment. "You drop everything. You walk away with nothing, no assets, no stake in the company, no claims to my money. You sign the divorce papers tonight." His nostrils flared. "And if I don't?" She smiled. "Then I send this to the police, the board of directors, and every media outlet in the country." Silence. James's lawyer turned to him. "If this is real, you don't have a case. You need to—" "Shut up," James snapped. Rebecca just waited. Let him stew. He had always underestimated her, always assumed she would break under pressure. But now he was the one cornered. Finally, after a long, tense pause, he exhaled sharply. "Fine." She slid the divorce papers across the table. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking as he signed his name. When he pushed them back, his eyes burned with pure hatred. "You'll regret this." Rebecca just smiled, standing up and tucking the papers into her bag. "No, James," she said softly. "The only one with regrets here is you." Then she turned and walked out. She had won. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new apartment, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the city lights flicker like stars. Everything was different now. The divorce was finalized. James had walked away with nothing. The company was thriving without his reckless spending and bad decisions. And as for him, he was exactly where he belonged, behind bars. It had taken less than 3 months for the authorities to catch up with him. Even after signing the divorce settlement, his crimes couldn't be erased. The evidence Rebecca had collected was more than enough to bury him. He had been charged with financial fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. His high-powered lawyer had tried to negotiate a deal, but in the end, the best he got was a 12-year sentence, with the possibility of parole in 8. Rebecca had attended the trial only once to watch the final verdict. James had met her gaze as they led him away in handcuffs. The hatred in his eyes had been unmistakable. But Rebecca? She had never felt lighter. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a name she hadn't expected. Ava. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before answering. "Rebecca." Ava's voice was softer than she remembered. Gone was the arrogant confidence, the smug tone that had once dripped with superiority. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to call." Rebecca leaned against the counter, sipping her wine. "I'm listening." There was a pause. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Ava let out a breath. "I thought I was winning, you know, that I had the upper hand. But James, he wasn't who I thought he was." Rebecca smirked slightly. "No, he wasn't. I left him before the trial," Ava admitted. "Not that it matters now, he got what he deserved." Rebecca swirled the wine in her glass. "Yes, he did." Another pause. "I moved to Porto Alegre," Ava continued. "I'm back in school, starting over." A small laugh. "Turns out I don't need a rich man to take care of me." Rebecca arched an eyebrow. "Good to know you finally figured that out." Ava hesitated. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but thank you for not destroying me along with him." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure if she forgave Ava, but she did recognize something in her voice. Growth. And that at least was worth something. "Good luck, Ava," Rebecca said simply, before ending the call. She placed her phone down, letting the quiet of the apartment settle around her. No James, no betrayal, no weight on her shoulders. For the first time in years, she was truly free. She raised her glass in the air, a private toast to herself. "To new beginnings," she murmured, taking a sip. The wine was rich, smooth, the taste of victory, and Rebecca had never enjoyed anything more.